Okay, everyone, we'll get started. So hello, everyone, and welcome to Thrive, Lead, Succeed. I'm your host, Sandi Hokansson, Executive Coach and CEO of Sound Leadership. Our topic today is accountable leaders. In a few minutes, I am going to introduce you to Dr. Vince Molinaro, and we are in for a real treat today with him joining us to talk about his new book of the same name. For those of you that are new to the Sound Leadership Circle, welcome. This is a forum for like-minded leaders to inspire each other and support each other as we are committed to our ongoing leadership development. We have a variety of industries represented, and we run approximately 9 webinars throughout the year, give or take. And we are very pleased to have you all with us today. If you're looking for past circle sessions, you can find all of those great resources from all of our previous speakers on my website at soundleadership.ca/resources. In June, when we last met, we had a fantastic leader join us, Shannon Cohen, and our topic was leadership wellness. And if you haven't had a chance to listen to Shannon, please have a look either from my website or on the YouTube channel. Okay, so I'm just going to admit a few more people here, and we will keep going. So I'm really thrilled to have the opportunity to introduce you to Vince today. You know, you're in for a treat, as I mentioned, because Vince is a leadership advisor, speaker, New York Times best-selling author of one of my favorite books of all time, The Leadership Contract. And for any of you who I've worked with one-on-one, you'll have heard me speak about that many times in our sessions. He's got a new book out called Accountable Leaders, which is what we're going to talk about today. I've known Vince for over 10 years, and he's one of my go-to people for thought leadership on the topic of leadership. And I'm thrilled to welcome Vince to the circle today. Hello, Vince.
Hey, how are you?
Good. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's great to have you with us as we kick off our fall season. So let's dive right into our Q&A, and I want to hear about what inspired you, first of all, to write about leadership accountability in your first book, The Leadership Contract.
Well, it goes back actually to what would probably be the other big crisis that many of us experienced a while ago, which was the global financial crisis. And I found at that time something really interesting happening. I was leading the leadership practice of a company in Canada called Knightsbridge Human Capital Solutions. We were a dominant brand in Canada and really expanding aggressively into the US and having good success with that. But I think what ended up happening, you know, what typically happens when there's an economic downturn, a lot of that discretionary spending around leadership and talent and training kind of gets, you know, hits a pause button. And then what I found is clients were kind of coming back to it. They were looking at everything with a pair of fresh eyes to kind of say, are these investments making any sense? And what I began to hear over and over again was this frustration that they realized they didn't realize it before the downturn, but realize it as they were coming through it, was we were investing more and more in leadership development, but not seeing it translate into better or stronger leadership. And certainly the downturn really tested their leaders, and companies saw those who were able to lead effectively and those who just basically weren't able to. And so they were now really posing a new problem that I hadn't encountered, which is really around what really became clear was that they weren't happy with the way their leaders were stepping up. And it wasn't until I met with one client, she was a head of human resources and OD for her financial services company, and she was at the height of her frustration, and she said, listen, we've come through this and we need our leaders to step up significantly to really drive our future growth, but they're not. And when I asked her what was happening, she said, well, they kind of like always look to the executive team for direction on every issue. We've got fundamental problems that we expect that they're going to tackle, and they look at one another thinking somehow it'll magically get resolved. And then she said, it's like they don't understand what it means to be a leader. And that moment just crystallized for me that there's something going on we've got to dig into. And that began for me the journey of the research and the thinking about leadership accountability, and then that got captured in the book, The Leadership Contract. And so when that came out in July of 2013, it just kind of resonated immediately. It was that the book came out at the right time as more and more people were understanding that leadership accountability was the challenge and was the gap that they were facing. And I was fortunate to have a book that provided ideas to really help leaders understand what it means to be a leader and how they needed to step up every single day.
Yeah, that's great. I love the story about how you came to it, and one of the things that I always think is so powerful about what you say in the book, in your first book, we'll get to your second book, is about the decision that, becoming a leader is a decision point in someone's career. And so many times we're motivated by the title or, the money, or wanting to move up the ladder, and without really reflecting on the decision as, am I committed? Do I understand this role? Am I prepared to go to the distance? Do I really understand what it means? And that's why I appreciate the kind of steps in your book and the process of your book, because it really helps, I think, people understand that this is a decision that you make, and you should make fully understanding what the obligation is and what you are accountable for. Hence, accountable leaders. So why don't you explain a little more detail for all of our members today, the 4 parts of your contract, and I'll let you tell us what those are.
Yeah, well, before I do that, I think just building off of the other story, as I sort of spent time thinking about, okay, so what's missing, and how do we help at that time my clients kind of grapple with this issue, and as I spent time thinking, and I've spent my career in the leadership area, as a consultant, as an advisor, as a researcher through my academic work, and I've held, like you, Sandy, I've held leadership roles as well. And this idea that what I've learned is that as human beings, we hold anyone we deem to be a leader to a higher standard of behavior. It's what we do naturally. So whether that person is, the president of a country, whether that person is a prime minister of a country, whether that person's a CEO, a senior executive, a manager, a leader in the community, it doesn't matter what the leadership role is. As humans, we think leader, and we automatically expect them to behave to a higher standard. And when they let us down, we can get pretty upset, right? And pretty angry and pretty frustrated. And then when they do step up and live up to those expectations, we want to emulate them, we admire them. And so to me, that implies that there is a contract that whenever anyone takes on a leadership role, they need to understand that they are being held to a higher standard of behavior. And I think that contract has always existed, but we've never really made it explicit. So back to your earlier point around the decision, is when I've asked leaders around the world, and I've traveled to 25 countries, been to 80 cities talking about these ideas, I've always asked, so how did you first get into a managerial or leadership role? And the number one answer is outstanding. The number one answer is, well, if I'm going to be honest, I got in by accident. And then the story goes on and says, well, I was really good at something. I was a great engineer. I was a great salesperson. I was a great analyst. I was a great accountant. I was a great marketer. We excel at something technical or something functional to such an extent that our behavior stands out relative to the rest of the employees. And we go to those people and say, hey, you're so good at this thing, we want to give you this other job that's completely unrelated to it. And we're going to give you a really cool title. We're going to give you more money. And here you go. And oftentimes people will say, I got no training, I got no support, I got no development. And that is how the experience has been for most people. It's because it's been accidental. It's because of either their tenure, they've been around longer than everyone, so let's give it to Mary, or let's give it to Bob because they've been with us for 15 years and we owe it to them. Whether they want it or not is irrelevant. And so that's what we have to understand, and why the contract is so important is to make people realize you're actually signing up for something. And like any contract, it has 4 terms and conditions. And the first one, and you've already alluded to it, Sandy, is that leadership is a decision and you have to make it. And you've got to be really clear on what the role demands, what the expectations are, and you've got to be prepared to do what's necessary to be the best leader that you can be. Now, what's also important is that it's okay to say no to a leadership role. That's an important decision. And sometimes we find that when you get offered an opportunity, many times people feel like, I couldn't say no. It was like, if I say no now, I'll never get this opportunity again. So I might as well say yes, even though you might be not fully, fully committed to the role. So it's a decision. And it's not just a one-time decision. Certain things will happen in the course of your career. You'll get a promotion to a new role that has new expectations where you've got to kind of recommit. You may have something happen in your external environment, like your company gets acquired, or you go through a merger or an acquisition and the expectations of you change. Or a global pandemic may break out, causing so much havoc to companies and industries, and you've got to pause. Am I up for this? Am I prepared to lead during this time? So it's not a one-time decision, and throughout your career, it's important and prudent to pause and think about it. The second term then is it comes with obligation. You've got to be clear on that it's not about you, it's not about your ego, it's not about what's in it for you, it's about everyone that you are there to bring value to. Your customers, your employees, your organization, your stakeholders, the communities in which you do business. And really you need to be clear on, how are you leaving things better? Because what I've learned is not only do we hold leaders to a higher standard of behavior, we also measure them based on, have you left things better for everyone? Not just for yourself, but for everyone. And so that becomes important. The third term of the leadership contract says that leadership is hard work. And you need to get tough and have the resilience and resolve to tackle the hard work. And what I've learned in working with hundreds and not thousands of leaders around the world is a lot of us in leadership roles avoid some of the hard work, particularly as it relates to people issues. So what do we hear? We avoid giving candid feedback. We avoid dealing with performance issues. We avoid making tough decisions that we know are in the best interest of the company, but may make us unpopular with our team, so we skirt them. And what I talk about and write about in the book is that when we avoid those hard things, and they're legitimately hard, not denying that, but when we avoid those things, we don't appreciate how we weaken ourselves, weaken our teams, and ultimately weaken our companies. And then the final term is that leadership is a community, and we need to connect with leaders across the organization, because it's no longer about this, this hero model of leadership with one leader at the top of the organization who has all the answers. It's more about how do we work together as leaders where we've got clarity on our strategy, we have high aspirations to be great as leaders, and we work together to execute that and engage our employees to drive the desired outcomes for a company. So those are kind of, in a nutshell, the 4 terms of a leadership contract.
Thank you. Thank you. I always love hearing you describe those. It's so important. I'm going to tell you that it doesn't matter what level of leader that I work with. Getting tough is probably one of the most common things that we reinforce and talk about. Those courageous conversations, giving feedback, getting ahead of it. That day-to-day kind of coaching and making some of those tough decisions. It's so critical. As part of your 4 steps. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the accountability gap as it relates to COVID and what we've been going through this year. You mentioned COVID. It's obviously been an unprecedented year. It's still going. We're not out of it yet. And there are new things coming at us still. I tend to think from, the leaders that I've been working with, I think leaders have stepped up a lot, have had to. I've been there for people, have had to show empathy. But I guess what I want to know from your opinion is, do you think that accountability gap has closed a little bit in these unprecedented times, or do you think the gap is as wide as ever?
Based on the clients I've worked with, I think the answer is a little bit all over the place. What I've heard through the organizations I work with is that it's a bit mixed. And what it really comes down to is not what they've done as a result of COVID, rather what were they doing before COVID hit? Were they actually strong from a leadership accountability standpoint? Did they build a strong sense of community? Did they already have a track record of tackling the hard work? And what I have found is those that made development a priority, had paid attention to really building as strong of a leadership culture as they could, they were feeling fairly confident. And in fact, that when you've already are operating from a position of good or great or strength, you rally together in more fundamental ways, and you even get stronger as you lead through that. At the same time, I have seen when organizations haven't had that, they were operating from a place of weakness, the results were more uneven. In some cases, they've had a few people step up in dramatic ways that they weren't expecting. They also shared that leaders who they thought were prepared to step up have completely disappointed them. And in some cases where there was lack of trust, where the leadership culture was weak, it's actually torn leaders apart, and employees have been completely disappointed. I've got an accountable leaders community, similar to what you have, and I did a poll on how to what extent are you satisfied with how your leaders have led at this point in time. And it was inspired by another webinar I was on, and this was a group of young leaders that I was speaking to, and we did a poll there, and the young leaders pretty much said 75% of them were very disappointed with the leadership they were seeing around the world, whether it was political or corporate, right? Which is not a great a data point.
No.
And then within my own community, which was more of a, like yours, senior executives and leaders in prominent roles, it was split down the middle. It was 50-50. So that's why I answer your question of it depends. It's a bit all over the place. But I think what I've learned is, because I like you, I reached out to all of my clients as this was unfolding, and I can't tell you how many would say, it's so great that we did this work, in my case with you last year with our leaders. I'm feeling really confident about our ability to weather through this and come out stronger. And those that didn't just really struggled.
Okay, interesting to hear about the demographic difference too, in polling some of the new entrants to the workplace versus more seasoned. Those of us that are seasoned, that's a good word to use.
Well, and it's funny because, I've always, and we'll get into the new book, but, when I started bringing these ideas out around the leadership contract, we also in parallel did global research that essentially confirmed what we found, that, almost 75% of companies we surveyed globally, over 3,000 respondents, senior executives completed this, said leadership accountability was a critical issue, but there was only 31% satisfaction with the degree of accountability demonstrated by leaders. So that we've got numbers that kind of quantifies the gap. We found that only about companies would say only about 49% of their leaders are defined as being truly accountable, and only about 20% of the organizations we survey have the courage to address the leaders who are struggling in their roles and being mediocre. And in the new book, I go deeper in terms of understanding the elements of mediocrity from a leadership standpoint, and the impact on our people is dramatic. And I've always Gen X and Gen Z have been maligned a lot, right? Millennials have been maligned for, they come in, they don't have motivation or whatnot, or there's this sense of entitlement. And I kind of have challenged that thinking, kind of going, what, you have them join your company, you have them report into a mediocre leader. Yeah, I would be pretty disengaged as well. So let's figure out, it's not about them, it's that we haven't really created an environment where there's leaders that they are inspired by. You do that, they're all in, but you surround them with a bunch of mediocre leaders. And so it doesn't surprise me that the younger cohort had a higher expectation of leaders and are more disappointed based on what they're seeing.
Okay, so what do you recommend for leaders that how can leaders be more accountable, and particularly during these unprecedented times?
Well, the focus on accountability really, as I said, emerged, from the client work. But as I thought about it, and I thought about what is the one way, right, that if I'm in a leadership role, if someone's in a leadership role, that if they focused on this, it would immediately put them on a different trajectory. And to me, accountability was it. Because what I also find, and I don't know, Sandi, if you find this in working with leaders, when you work with leaders in the kind of development programs we do, there's a lot of confusion out there about what it really means to lead. And they'll read a book about authenticity, or they'll read a book that talks about the need for leaders to be vulnerable, or to demonstrate empathy, and whatever it is. And those things are all good ideas, but what I find, and leaders tell me, is they can't see how they get from point A to point B. And a lot of times those ideas are hyped up, right? Because I could be a tyrant and a dictator and a bully as a leader and be very authentic. And so that's where leaders get confused. Accountability is a bit clearer. So I begin my, when I do keynotes, I begin my talks by asking a question of, what does it really mean to be a leader today? And I have people answer it, and they come up with words like, vision and inspirational, and all the classic words you'd expect of what it means to be a leader. And then I say, now I want you to come up with words to answer this question. What does it mean to be an accountable leader? It's remarkable how much more focused the answers become. It's about results. It's about driving performance. It's about having the courage to hold people accountable for their behavior. It's about not tolerating mediocrity. It's a very different list of words that are more attainable. And that's the feedback I've always gotten as people read the leadership contract and some of my other work, say, I can see how I can get from point A to point B. I can see how I can actually get better as a leader. And that's what I've always learned in my own leadership roles. You've had very senior roles, is as much as I've always shown up being accountable, if I was honest with myself, there was even more room for me to be accountable. And so that's why, to me, that's the case. So let's fast forward now to where we are with COVID. Well, I wrote an ebook called Upended to help leaders apply the 4 terms of the leadership contract. So what do you need to do? Well, don't just assume you're going to step up wonderfully at this crisis. Take some time to pause and think about, are you all in? Are you fully committed to lead at this time? Because leaders have been pulled and challenged in ways that many have never dealt with before. The other thing that we have to understand is that our economy, since the financial crisis, we've had an 11-year run of growth. And I've talked to a lot of clients that says we've had a lot of leaders who, if you were in your early 30s when the recession was over, and now you've had 11 years of where you've been a leader and all you've known is good times and growth, and you've never dealt with a significant crisis, that's a challenge. And no one's talking about this because some leaders approach it with bravado, right? And ego. I got this. I don't know if you got a global pandemic, systemic racism, climate change issues with forest fires, and all the other stuff that's happened as a result. Mm-hmm. So it's better to be a bit humble and to pause and say, okay, am I all in? Am I fully committed? What is my obligation right now as a leader? Who needs me the most right now? My employees, my team, my family, my community. What is the hard work that I have to continue to do? Because what leaders have always struggled having those tough conversations, as you said, but now that many of us are working remotely and virtually, I'm hearing people saying, well, now they think they can just take the foot off the accelerator completely, right? Well, I can't have those conversations because now we're doing it over a Zoom call or an MS Teams call. No, you still have to. In fact, accountability becomes even more critical when you're managing a remote workforce. And then how do you build community and work in an aligned manner with your fellow colleagues? So those questions become, even more critical. And where my thinking is now, based on my conversations, is as tough as the last 6 to 7 months have been, I think, and I'm using the term re-entry, I think what's coming is going to be a tougher leadership challenge than what we've had. So what I'm hearing is leaders saying, we've been in crisis mode. So we've been operating in crisis mode, and that requires a different way of leading. But now, as we try to figure out how do we adapt to the new realities, how do we adapt to a second wave, how do we adapt to the fatigue people have of working in this way, it's going to be more complex. And I'm hearing more clients saying, okay, we've dialed up on empathy in a big way, but now we've got to figure out where the dial needs to be set, because we've got to come to terms with, we got a company to run here. And so those are not, I don't think there's easy answers for those kinds of things. Is that making sense?
Yeah, for sure. I really liked how you started with, when you're making the decision and how far in you're going to go, and the pause, because I think the companies that have, and the leaders that have kind of put people first and put policies first and put safety first and really put the employee back at the center have succeeded, or are succeeding, because that has been, that message was I think was needed. Okay. Yeah. And so that's key. I also liked how you touched about remote, just that the fact is you're not off the hook. You've got to keep doing it. You've got to find a new way to do it. And I'm coaching on those things, on how to performance manage, remotely. It's really important. Yeah. And I also agree the long term. I really agree that's why I said we're not in any ways through this, and we're going to be transformed by it. We're already transforming, so the leadership is transforming as well, and I think the complexity is there. So one thing that I'd like to raise too is just that their leaders have, it's been overwhelming, for leaders, and so maybe you can try. I want to move on in the time. I want to talk about your new book. So I don't want to get too far down a rabbit hole here, but I wouldn't mind just hearing a little bit about, what your thoughts are there, because there's been so much coming fast and furious at leaders, and the best ones are trying to focus and keep the company in mind and think about results and all those things, as well as people. But it has been a little bit really accelerated for leaders. So do you have any comments on that before and then I want to ask you about your second book?
Yeah, well, and I think it all,
it all goes together.
It goes together because they kind of build off of one another. But my take, and this is just kind of my perspective, right? I think the kind of work that leaders need to do is obviously, it's you got to take care of yourself, right? You've got to take care of your people. You've got to find what are the outlets that you have to manage the stress. And I talk a lot about in the leadership contract, and that gets extended further in accountable leaders, around the resilience and resolve. And there's a lot being talked about around resilience, right? And that's critical. But resilience as a definition is about, bouncing back. But when you're in the kind of condition we are now, we need to balance that with resolve, which is this kind of grit, this as Angela Duckworth talks about, this kind of tenacity to say, we're going to see ourselves through this. That doesn't mean you're not going to have uncertainties, but it's, and I think that's what's going to be required. And I think you've got to really be open to have those conversations around, are you really kind of in this for the long term, right? I remember when we hit the global financial crisis, and I remember meeting with my team and everyone already starting to get nervous because, we were in a talent and coaching and development business that normally would get affected by a lot, stop in spending. And I said to the team, as a way of helping them reframe it, I said, now we'll see how good we really are. We're pretty good. We think we're a pretty good team, and when the seas are calm, anyone can kind of lead, kind of navigate the oceans. But when the waters are really choppy and the storms are coming, that's a different task altogether. And I think that's the work that leaders need to do. You've got to have enough of humility and self-confidence that you've got the resolve to see things, to see through this. But then you've got to work with your team, and you've got to start monitoring how are they doing. And you can actually tell this through a Zoom call. You can look at someone and you can kind of gauge, hey, how you doing there? What's going on? That's the kind of work I think we need to do to help kind of catch people's own stress behavior, catch how they're doing. I think some people will be doubting themselves. Not only have companies been put under a lot of pressure, as you know, so have employees, because those who have young children or those who have aging parents, and they've got work and home has merged like we've never encountered before. So we've all got a lot on our plates, and the empathy isn't just about caring for people. That's important. It's really being active in understanding where are people at any moment in time, and helping them build the resilience and resolve. And so I wrote another ebook called Adversity, where I took some of the ideas from accountable leaders to say, here's how you help people build resilience and resolve. But it really is contingent upon you as a leader paying more attention to it. Because I think, as I said, as we move forward, we're going to need to be really critical around that.
Great. Thank you for commenting on that, Vince. Okay, so let's move on to accountable leaders, and obviously, as you mentioned, they're tied together. The one follows the other, so they are connected. But tell us a little bit about the key messages that you have for leaders from your new book.
Well, it came out of really trying to solve client problems, and so what clients said when they worked with a leadership contract was, this is great. It's helped me and our leaders understand what it means to be a leader, understand how we need to step up, and as I said before, how to get from point A to point B to improve our leadership. But the expectations are greater. I don't just need to step up at an individual level. I need to build an accountable team. Mm-hmm. And I need to work with leaders across the organization to drive our priorities in an effective way, in a way that's mm-hmm. aligned to the leadership culture. And so through that work, I began to say, okay, so what does that look like now? What does it look like to build a truly accountable team? And how do you work with colleagues across an organization to drive innovation, drive collaboration, drive a more integrated business strategy that a lot of companies have? And so that's what the book, probably, a good third of the book really dives into. And it kind of has a chapter on understanding individual leadership accountability that shares a lot of the research, and how do you hold others accountable to be leaders. It has a chapter on what does leadership accountability look like through a team lens, and how do you build an accountable team. And then it has a chapter on leadership accountability from a culture standpoint, and what do you do to build culture as a leader. But what I've also found is that the companies and the clients that really made this work well implemented a dual response. They had leaders who committed to doing all those things at a personal, team, and culture level. But then I found that the board or the CEO, the senior executives, the head of HR, the head of talent, they put a number of practices in place to help really fuel whatever leaders may have been doing. Because what I have found is, if I show up every day, being an accountable leader and trying my damnedest to do that, but then the organization doesn't have practices in place to support me, I can only go so far, right? If the organization avoids dealing with mediocrity, I can only go so far, because I'm surrounded by leaders, others who are struggling in their roles. And so you need what I call this dual response that is both at an individual, team, culture, but then also organizational level. And at the organizational level, it really is around 4 strategies. Everything kind of gets built off of the 4 terms of the leadership contract. So you've got to make leadership accountability a priority, and I show boards and CEOs and senior executives and heads of HR kind of how to do that. You've got to define clear expectations of your leaders through a leadership contract or a leadership model. Amazon has done it. I talk about the Amazon story. I also share a company you know well, the work that the Adecco group did in creating its own leadership contract. I talk about how you have to address the mediocre leaders, because it's two sides of a coin. You can't hope for accountability to show up and then not address and support the leaders who are struggling in their roles. And finally, you've got to create mechanisms to help leaders build relationships with one another across divisions, across departments, so you can build that leadership culture. So that's what Accountable Leaders does. But at the end of the day, what I also learned is it really positions a deeper understanding of accountability, because what I have found was that, and you know, it's fascinating when you travel the world. I traveled extensively in Latin America, and in the Spanish language, they don't have a word for accountability. So, you know, and there's other countries that I've traveled to where that exists. They don't have a word for it, so they don't even know how to think about the construct. And yet, when I talked about my research and talked about the ideas, they said, we don't have a word for it, but we have this problem, right? And so, but then I found that some people think of accountability in a really heavy-handed way, like, I will hold you accountable, right? Or it has a blaming kind of connotation to it, where if something screws up, it's this, who's accountable, right? And yet the reality is, really sustainable leadership accountability is inspired. And so if you set the tone, because what I've learned, even in my own leadership roles, is you can't ask anyone to be accountable if you're not accountable yourself. If you're not accountable and you ask others to be accountable, that's a double standard. And employees see through that, right? If you have young kids, they see through that, right? When you know, I'm sure, you know, as a parent, you tell your kids to do one thing and then they immediately go, well, wait a minute, you're not doing that, right? They call it out right off the bat. That's no fair. It's a double standard, right? And so that's why in the book cover, I've got this image of a ripple effect, because it's like, it's your job to create a positive ripple around accountability. And if more leaders embrace accountability, set the tone and inspire others, then others will most likely follow. That's been my experience.
Excellent, excellent. One of the takeaways for me from your most recent book, in addition to continuing the individual, accountability pieces and the how-to maps, the deeper way that you go about it, is I like the discussion around the systemic components. I think one of the things that really 2020 has been a conversation about is those two things, is what we're doing as individuals and what we can control as individuals, but also there's just the systemic challenges that we face, within our organizations where we work, our governments, the politics, you name it, and the racial injustice, everything that we're seeing. There's some very deep systemic challenges that we face. And so I think as leaders, when you're addressing both of those two sides of the coin, it's really helpful to put it in and to realize that, there is only so much you can do. However, I am a big believer that we're all responsible for, working from our center of power. And so, that is where it starts, right? But I think it was powerful to also just, touch on that systemic piece, because we all deal with it. It's there.
Well, yeah, and you're so right for flagging it, because where my head is at right now is what 2020 has certainly made me realize is there are these chronic issues that are not new, right? Systemic racism, diversity, inclusion, equity. Equity of haves and have-nots. That whether we want to deny it or the reality is, we have to figure these things out. And we have to figure these things out at a societal level, but also within our organizations. And I talk about in the book, like the Business Roundtable did last year, kind of really rethinking about the purpose of a corporation, because corporations have become the dominant institution, on our planet, and many of them are great and are leading the way on also addressing social issues. And I think we need more corporate CEOs that go beyond, earnings per share and profit. Those aren't bad words, but on top of it, realize their responsibility to even make the world a better place, right?
Yeah.
And if I think about what, even your leadership that I had, a bit of a glimpse to, in your C-suite roles, you always brought that systemic perspective, and you always kind of invested in leadership and making sure you had a strong leadership culture in place. And those are the leaders that I always enjoy working, because they kind of get it, right? As opposed to working with a CEO that is just focused on driving the bottom line and not as much paying attention to engagement or to culture or to leadership or to social issues as well.
The secret is that those things drive the bottom line.
Yeah.
That's the secret. So it's all one, right? They're all feeding each other. So we've got about 5 minutes left, and I've got one question that's come in through the chat. But I want to just open it up now and just see. It's great to see some of you out there with your videos on. Mr. Jeremy Peters, I haven't seen for a while. I'm looking at you. But it's just great to see everybody on that's turned the video on. Thank you. That's what the nice thing of switching to Zoom. I'm getting to see some video. Anyway, I just want to does anyone have a question that hasn't been sent in chat? And if you do, if you want to ask it, you can just unmute yourself and remute. We'll just give everyone a minute there. Is there anyone out there?
Yep, I do. Can you hear me, Sandy? It's Jeremy.
Yes. Hi.
Can you hear me? Hi.
Hi.
So Vince, such a pleasure to speak with you.
Well, thank you for all your support on social media. I've appreciated it. It was great when I saw you pop up on the call.
My pleasure. I use a lot of your chapters for the framework of my community, my leadership community, so it's my pleasure for sure.
Awesome.
Just wanted to share with you, recently at Randstad, we performed a survey where we discussed business recovery trends with over 2,000 clients. And when it came to the topic of leadership development, we found very interesting that when we sent a survey to the C-suite leaders, 45% of them felt that their leadership communities were really struggling with digital transformation. And I don't mean the technical side, I mean more of the, I guess we'll call it the soft skill, leading a team virtually. And what we found when we digged a little deeper is 3 core skill sets came up that they felt were lacking in leadership communities when we did talk to the C-suites. 55% of them said adaptability came up. The word collaboration came up 45%, and the emotional intelligence came up 38%, which are all, as you can imagine, increasingly valuable in today's tech-driven workplace. Just want to get your opinion. Would you agree with that? What would you add to that list, just from your observations at your purview level?
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna dig up the research, because that sounds really fascinating. But the reality is that those capabilities have always been critical, right, in driving all kind of transformation, whether it's digital transformation or whatever. But now the gaps, I think, are even more apparent, because we've added on top of everything else we were trying to drive and change, the pandemic and the economic fallout and the emotional fallout of all of that. So the adaptability is critical. That, I talked to a CEO yesterday, that very successful company, but realizing that the need of leaders to be more nimble, to move more quickly, to be faster. Collaborative, basically came off of a call this morning with a client about that's got to be that's the whole push there, and they've got entrenched, that their term is stovepipes or silos, where there's just not even the openness to do that. And then the emotional intelligence is but that's been a topic that's been around for a long time. But I think now it's just like we realize it's not a nice to have. I think all of these 3 around adaptability, collaboration, and emotional intelligence are must-haves, right? And unfortunately, a lot of people in leadership roles, because we've typically put in strong technical performers in those roles, haven't really developed them, right? And so we've got to help them fast track some of that.
Excellent. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy, for a great question.
Okay.
Okay, so we're at our time, and I'd love to keep going, but I always want to make sure we're you know, respectful of everyone and the people that have joined today. So why don't and I have just a follow-up after we wrap up, Vince, with everyone, just a couple other comments to make. But Vince, why don't you just give us a kind of a wrap up here on if there's a key message you have for leaders that are stepping up this year and have really stepped up and are working on being even, you know, more accountable. Is there anything you'd like to leave them with today?
Yeah, it'd probably be like three things. Is you're going to need to dig deeper than you've had, and that's not a bad thing. That's just I think the challenge that we're going to be facing. So dig deep. Number three is really be clear on who needs you the most right now. And number three is kind of build your tribe. You know, leadership can be lonely. It doesn't need to be. And at this moment in time, you know, reach out to your team, reach out to your peers, you know, build your community because it's, you know, a community can do what one person can't do by him or herself. And so those are the three things I'd leave as parting ideas.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I love that, build your tribe. I just wrote a little bit on building a leadership community, and it's so important. Thank you so much, Vince, for joining us today.
Great.
It's been a really insightful conversation. I always enjoy learning from you, and I know everyone has a lot of takeaways from the time you spent with us today. So thank you very much.
Great. All the best, everyone. And thanks
Thank
again,
you.
Sandy, for the
Thank you
opportunity.
so much,
I'll
Vince.
sign off.
Yeah.
Take care.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Vince.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Just a couple minutes here, and I know we're wrapping up. Just a couple things. I always like to leave you with a little reflection. So some things you might want to think about is how would you rate your level of accountability on a scale of 1 to 10? And to quote Vince, how far in are you? How far leaning are you leaning in? And has that increased this year? And can you think about some examples of how you demonstrate your accountability? And are there any areas that you could step up in, perhaps have come to mind as you're listening in today? And then finally, how can you help your own leaders on your team become more accountable, right? I didn't like that mediocrity word that Vince used. I'm sure none of us want that. We don't want any of that. So how can you help your leaders lean in a little bit more and step up? So those are some things maybe just to keep in mind. Our next webinar together is October 28th at 12 noon Eastern Standard Time, and we're going to hear from Andrea Sugden, who's the Chief Global Sales Officer for Workforce Logic, and we're going to talk about sales leadership during unprecedented times, which is near and dear to our hearts. And I think we'll all be interested in that topic and thinking about how we can focus on the top line and how to take advantage of some new opportunities in this era as well. So that's it. I'm going to leave you with that today. Thank you again all for joining in. Great to see some of you with your videos on or off. Great. Thank you so much for coming. And we'll see you next month. Bye-bye, everybody.